Welcome to the Stormsurf video surf forecast for the week starting Sunday, October 23rd. Looking at significant wave heights for the North Pacific Ocean, we see an area here in the Eastern Gulf just starting to show some indications of low pressure developing. This is forecast to build some in the next 24 hours. We also see an area of seas in the 18-foot range. This part of a gale that was off of Kamchatka just a day or two ago and has produced a little bit of swell pushing towards Hawaii. You can actually see it right there moving towards the coast. And then another small area of low pressure off Japan, not expected to do anything. Let's get into the details. First off, let's examine the gale that pushed off Kamchatka and actually the Northern Kuril Islands starting 06Z on Friday. Built to 30 feet or so off of northern Japan on Friday at 18Z, and then to 32 feet Friday evening, still in the far northwest Pacific, and then slowly migrated up towards the Aleutians on Sunday and dissipated. This is good for a small bit of swell, of course, moving towards Hawaii, and even smaller for the U.S. West Coast, and it will probably be buried in lesser period swell that is expected in this area upon arrival. And now we'll start the forecast tour with upper-level winds, as we always do. These winds up about 30,000 feet help support the formation of gales. When those gales do form, help direct their path. We have a reasonably healthy flow, not exceptional, but notice it is down about 40 north. It is continuous, it is not split, and it is tracking almost the whole way to the U.S. West Coast. This is a significant improvement from last week when things were pretty just kind of shattered, not really well organized. And we have a couple little patches here of 130 knot winds there, 150 knot here, and a little bit of a trough. That's what we're looking for, a dip in the jet to the south. That helps form a counterclockwise flow aloft and down at the surface. That is the hallmark of low pressure. Of course, low pressure helps generate winds. Winds generate seas. Seas, as they radiate away from the fetch area, create swell, and swell, of course, produces surf when it hits your beach. All right, so with that said, we roll out. We're looking for a trough, and you can see sort of a trough trying to organize here, a little bit of a dip, but again, it's mainly landlocked behind the Kuril Islands and Kamchatka here. But we see another trough developing on Monday off the U.S. West Coast, really focused right here off of Oregon. I'll roll this out, and there you go. That is a pretty classic sign of a trough with being fed by a small area of 150 knot winds. This trough here off Kamchatka continues, but most of the wind energy is pushing north. Also notice here, this pattern, this ridge over the dateline Western Gulf sort of thing. Now remember, La Niña, the cool water from La Niña is down on the equator right somewhere in between about 180 and 150, 140 right there. And the thought is that where the cool water is, that's where high pressure would build aloft. Likewise, if there was warm water, warmer than normal water here, low pressure would be here, and you'd have a semi-permanent trough. So the thought is this winter, with La Niña, this displaced Modoki La Niña, that high pressure would sit here, and the storm track would generally come off Japan, then ridge up, go almost into the Bering Sea, then fall into the Gulf of Alaska. This has been what the pattern's been so far. So it's holding quite well with the water pattern, the water temperature patterns down here on the equator. Okay, that said, let's move on. We move into Tuesday. The trough off the Gulf actually builds, but it gets steep, sort of pinches off. That would help limit or suppress low pressure development. Anyway, that trough falls further south, but again, pinched off, not particularly of interest. Then we get into Thursday or so. Another trough tries to organize off the Kuril, ridges over the dateline, just like what we've been seeing, and you can bet what's going to happen here. Sure enough, some sort of a trough again tries to form, but rather pinched off, but of more interest. Notice what's going on over here off Japan. Two little pockets of 190 knot winds, the jet well consolidated, and then starting to push heavily into the West Pacific while this sort of cutoff trough thing still continues off the U.S. West Coast. And we just roll this out, and you can see now we have a very, very nice, rather energetic jet with 170 knot winds getting ready to push into the Gulf. A pre-existing pattern of troughing here has been in play almost a week. As we get to 180 hours out, one would expect that some sort of low pressure type system, gales, will develop in the Gulf of Alaska, and maybe even something here, some sort of proto system pushing off Kamchatka, but most of the development long term would be expected in this area. If anything, I'd expect this trough to deepen and dig out here, but we'll see. That's a week off, and the models are not believable that far into the future. Let's go take a look down at the surface. So here we are, surface level pressure, surface level winds as expected. Weak low pressure here off Japan. Another weak low pressure developing off Oregon. And in fact, winds were turning to the south today about midday in the San Francisco Bay Area, indicative of a building front off the coast. We'll roll this out. And sure enough, there you go, low pressure Monday, a gale, 40-knot winds aimed at Oregon, down into northern California, also a fair amount of south winds. Also notice low pressure here in the northwest Pacific, but all the fetch aimed to the north. That's because you have high pressure sitting right north of where that cold water is. So it creates a gradient, but high pressure circulates clockwise, low pressure counterclockwise. You get a gradient that is a tightening of the isobars between the two. That creates wind, but it's all aimed up to the north. Does Hawaii no good, does no one any good, except maybe the Aleutian Islands. Anyway, we'll roll this out. But notice, here we go, our gale off of Oregon on Monday night, 45-knot winds, almost impacting the coast. Mariners beware. But here in the Northwest Pacific, we have a pretty good-sized fetch of 30, 35-knot winds. That certainly should generate swell. And then low pressure continues off the U.S. West Coast on Tuesday. Notice this fetch continues here just south of the Aleutians in the Northwest Pacific Ocean into Wednesday morning. Roll this out some more. Another low pressure forecast here in the Gulf of Alaska on Thursday. Falling south, notice that little pocket of 55-knot winds there for a second. Maybe that could generate something of interest. And falling towards the U.S. West Coast on Friday, that could possibly make some swell for the weekend. Probably not so much aimed at Hawaii. All the fetch seems to be more down, aimed this direction. Persistent fetch, though, here off of Kamchatka. Swell, small swell from Hawaii to result. And then we get into the weekend, a much larger low is forecast here. Again, the same pattern, just going on lows here, high pressure in the middle, in between. And we have a storm on Sunday with 55-knot winds forecast on the northern dateline region, aimed somewhat at Hawaii, mainly more towards California and maybe southern Oregon, building and looking pretty solid come 174 into 180 hours out. No surprise given that the jet stream is raging here. And, of course, way too early to believe any of it, but it looks pretty good. Let's go take a look how these winds are going to affect the ocean surface. So here we go, 18Z on Sunday. We see just the beginning hints of something going on here off of Oregon and a little bit of activity here in the West Pacific. We roll this out. Here we go, 12Z Monday. What is that, 22-foot seas, building to 26-foot seas, 27-foot seas officially. And right on the Oregon, North California border and off the coast, probably, what is that, about 300 or 400 nautical miles. So a very close proximity storm, raw swell to result, pushing down into Northern California on Tuesday and pretty much raking the Oregon and Washington coast. Probably not too surfable except in very protected locations. And seas developing off Kamchatka, what is that, 24 feet? And pushing 23 feet, broader area, but pushing to the east. Some swell should result from that. That was a rather large fetch, or large area, 20-foot seas here. So Hawaii and, of course, the U.S. West Coast could get something. Notice there's some sort of tropical system forecast here, 96 hours out. Doubt it's going to happen. Anyway, we'll roll out some more. And then we see our little system here developing in the Gulf, falling southeast. This is possibly a weekend swell producer for California. What is that, 22, 24, 25-foot seas falling southeast. And then we see our system developing over the northern dateline region with 42-foot seas. This is as of on Sunday, 18Z on Sunday, and probably building bigger than that as it moves into the Gulf, if any of this is believable. So a reasonably active pattern forecast. Again, this issue with high pressure over here tends to push the storms to the north, which then tends to make the swell angle rather northerly relative to California. That sort of cuts off Southern California from the meat of the action. You have to get around Point Conception and better exposure up into this area here. And suffice it to say, nothing's going on in the southern hemi. So with that, we move on to our long-term outlook. What's going on beyond? What's happening with the Madden-Julian Oscillation and La Niña, and how will that affect our surf a month, 2, or even 3 months out, or at least give us some clues as to what we can expect? As usual, we want to understand what's going on with the Madden-Julian Oscillation. The MJO, for short, is typically this pattern of, call it like low pressure and high pressure, but it travels on the equator the whole way around the planet. But specifically, we're interested in what's going on in the Pacific Ocean. Here's the West Pacific here, East Pacific here. We're looking at, well, in this chart, actual wind speeds is from buoys, the TAO buoy array, a series of buoys strung across the equator the whole way across the Pacific, used for monitoring El Nino and La Nina, but also can be used for seeing what's going on with the MJO. The main area we're interested in the MJO is what we call the Kelvin wave generation area from 135 east, that's here like New Guinea, out to about the date line, or maybe 170 west, not even getting to Hawaii. Okay, notice trades, east winds here in control of the equatorial Pacific and easterly in the Kelvin wave generation area, but not as strong. Here's differences in normal for this time of year, and you see basically winds are neutral, not normal across this area, but in the Kelvin wave generation area, starting, where is that? Right about here, and 5 degrees north or south of the equator, so you can draw a box right there. See, light easterly. So when the MJO is in the active state, winds are neutral or slightly westerly. That tends to feed the jet stream. That tends to help promote storm development in the northern hemisphere in the winter, and of course, generate surf. When it's easterly, that suggests the inactive phase of the MJO. I'll call it the high pressure part of the pattern, and that tends to suppress storm development. So right now, and this data runs about a day behind, right now it's suggesting like light easterly anomalies, which would suggest perhaps the inactive phase of the MJO. Here's another chart, actual wind anomalies, 850 millibar wind anomalies, not down at the surface, up about 4,400 feet, but good proxy for what's going on down at the surface. And the Kelvin wave generation area, here's the date line. Here's, I think this is about 150 or so east. So Kelvin wave generation area right in about that area. Here's back on September 23rd. The blues suggest easterly anomalies. The reds are westerly anomalies. This is almost in the Indian Ocean. This is the main part of the Kelvin wave generation area. And all for September, October, we were in this inactive phase of the MJO, but here's the forecast now starting October 23rd, and here's the good news right here. Look at that. It's supposed to die out on about the 27th, so what's that, 4 days from now or so? And then you see weak westerly anomalies, and we don't see any building pattern of, these are westerly anomalies. We don't see any building easterly anomalies. That would suggest that whatever, we've been going through this long stretch, that's what, almost a month or more of easterly anomalies, and that's about normal length for the inactive phase, the MJO. It runs about 4 to 6 weeks in one phase, and then the thought is maybe 4 to 6 weeks in the other phase, which means maybe, just maybe, we're starting to enter a period that would be more supportive of storm development and therefore swell development, and that happens to coincide nicely with what the models are suggesting about storm development over the date line out about 5 or 6 days out. So we'll see. That's the thinking. Who knows how it's really going to play out. Here's another model. Of course, this is the statistic model. There's South America, Mexico, West Pacific, Australia there. If you see blues here, that would suggest the active phase, the MJO, yellows, the inactive phase. And what we see per this is a dead neutral MJO pattern. Now, there has been some suggestions of actually the active phase over here for a couple of weeks, but that wasn't ever true. Now, it's saying dead neutral. Who knows? This model, the GFS model, the ensemble GFS suggests 5 days out, the inactive phase of the MJO is supposed to show up, and 2 weeks out, it's supposed to be in control. So the two models are contradicting each other at the moment. Hard to know what's going to go on. Let's take another look. Here are our phase diagrams. These are used for also tracking the MJO. The heavy dot is where the active phase of the MJO is, and you're looking at this going, what's this mean? Well, assume you're looking down on the North Pole. The circle does not represent the North Pole, though, but the active phase of the MJO travels west to east from the Indian Ocean over the maritime continent, consider this Bali, New Guinea, over the date line, into the West Pacific, over into the west coast, over America, into the Atlantic, over Africa, back to the Indian Ocean. So the active phase of the MJO just continually moves around like that. The closer to this circle it is, the weaker it is. The further away, the stronger it is. Right now, that would say a very, very weak, if not imperceptible, active phase of the MJO. And for the next 2 weeks, maybe forecast to make a little peak in the West Pacific, and that's it. That per the ECMF model. The GEFS model suggests the active phase of the MJO, about 5 days from now, might make an appearance, but it's supposed to be hard to say where that is. I've got a chart here, but let's say roughly over the U.S. West Coast or almost into the interior of America. That won't do anything for us in terms of storm production. And then our trusty model, the CFS model, again, 850 millibar winds. Now, this is past data here going up to the current and then future forecast. This goes out 3 months. The oranges and yellows are westerly anomalies. The blues are easterly anomalies. Here is the date line right here. The Kelvin wave generation area is right in here. And you can see currently that looks like easterly anomalies in the Kelvin wave generation area, just weak, and then we can sort of do this, and then we'll overlay the MJO, and sure enough, we see that the active phase of the MJO has been in control, and it's all but gone now. Supposedly, we're in a dead neutral state, and that's sort of what the other models suggest. Though with easterly anomalies forecast a couple days out, that's sort of different than what the other models suggest. And then these dotted lines are suggestive of the inactive phase of the MJO, and here's another octave phase. I mean, you can kind of look at this, but the real takeaway is the MJO is exceedingly weak. It's really not influencing the atmosphere a whole lot at all, so this is how this goes. When you have La Niña in play, it tends to suppress the active phase of the MJO, which is the very thing that helps feed the jet stream and build surf. And it tends to sort of build high pressure, if nothing else. During El Niño, it tends to feed the active phase of the MJO. So we have a very weak La Niña in play right now. So it's sort of stomping on the MJO, but not suppressing it, not really doing anything one way or the other. We just sort of go into this MJO slump where nothing happens. So that's not bad. I mean, it could be a lot worse. Typically, after a strong El Niño, and we've said this before, you get a raging La Niña, and it just stomps the heck out of the jet stream and swell production. We're not there, so anything we get is a bonus. And, you know, this fact that La Niña is weak is really most interesting. And we've actually been thinking now that perhaps, just perhaps, El Niño didn't fully discharge, and that there might be still some lurking warm water in the Pacific. And as you get into the charts later in this presentation, you'll see some of that. And that maybe, just maybe, another El Niño might be in store a couple of years out because this El Niño didn't fully discharge all the heat. I mean, that's what El Niño does. It's a vent, just like hurricanes, just like thunderstorms. It's a way of getting heat off the ocean surface and venting it into the upper atmosphere in an attempt to try to cool the surface of the Earth. And this last El Niño was kind of not well organized and didn't effectively vent as much heat as one might want it to. Again, a very out there kind of theory. So anyway, right now, weak MJO pattern is forecast per this model. And the other models are saying, basically hinting around the same thing, just not a strong MJO pattern. So the jet will do what it wants to, and we can't really look at the MJO and use it as too much of an indicator. So next we need to look at the ocean. What's going on in the ocean? Because the atmosphere is kind of, it's not really doing anything. It's kind of neutral, nothing really significant. But we'll get a better sense of what's happening with La Niña from looking at the ocean. And looking at absolute water temperatures, here's the West Pacific, here's the East Pacific. We're looking at depth. These are anchor lines on those buoys that we talked about that go the whole way across the equator from East Pacific to West Pacific. The X's are the sensors on the buoy anchor lines. And you can see warm water, 30° centigrade, 28° line right here. Suggests all the warm water is pulled up in the West Pacific, and the warm water pool is very shallow in the East Pacific. This is pretty typical of La Niña. During El Niño, a lot of this warm water starts making its way to the east, and this line here, the 28° isotherm, starts starts building at depth, and you get a lot of warm water over this way. Anyway, differences from normal for this time of year. You see, again, 1 degree above normal anomalies in the West Pacific, kind of a neutral pattern in the East Pacific, which isn't too bad. This one little pocket of 3-degree anomalies has recently developed here at depth. But otherwise, normally you'd want to see a warmer temperatures, but you know what? Given it's La Niña, this is an exceedingly weak La Niña water temperature pattern at depth. Here's another model. It suggests perhaps that cooling is a little bit stronger than what the other one suggested, but not appreciably so. And then here we go, upper ocean heat anomalies. This is from last year, the last of our Kelvin waves, warm water traveling from west to east driven by El Nino and a very strong active phase of the MJO. This is Kelvin wave number 5. Here was number 6. Then you got into March of this year. Cool water all in the West Pacific, where there is now warm water. That cool water flows to the east, and that ushers in La Niña. And here we go. You would think that this pool would have built and gotten stronger, especially over in here by now. But no, it's, what's that? 1, 2, somewhere in here to 1 to 1.5 degrees in pockets. And, just really pretty weak. If we can hold like this or just not get a whole lot worse in the next 2 months, we'll be in pretty good shape for a rebound from a strong El Nino. Now let's go take a look at the surface. So here is sea surface temperature differences from normal. And this is what we were talking about. Notice all this heat here. Warm, these reds and oranges, much warmer than normal, even along the immediate coast of Peru, up into the tropics here, Mexico or so. And this here is your cooler pools around here. Notice, typically, if this was a strong La Niña, you'd see a lot of blues and greens here, building strong in this area around the Galapagos, and then getting caught by those trades that we saw. Remember those strong east trades earlier in the presentation? Driving an upwelling pattern across the equator and building a cool pool out into here. We're not seeing so much. That little pocket here, there's a little pulse here and here of cool. And there's been some, pulse of easterly winds. But, this is the way it's been over in this sector here, the Niña 1.2 region out to about 110 or so. It's the La Niña signal has been very weak. All the activity has been from about 120 west and beyond. Let's take another look at the trend. This is a trend now for the next for the past 7 days. Here we go. Now this is interesting. The blues suggest where there's cooling, the reds and orange where there's been warming. We had a very strong tongue of dark blue and purple waters here a couple of days ago. It didn't even build till, I don't know, I think it was a week ago. Got very strong midweek. Now it's rapidly fading. Again, so it just La Niña pulsing, but not having any staying power really. And this is back to almost what we saw before. Notice this cooling trend here and here is what you also see here and here. It's suggesting that, just showing that where these guys came from and what the trend is. Nothing too remarkable. If this strong pool of cooling here, if that would still hold a week or 2 weeks out, we might get scared that La Niña is building. But this is, just pretty much the typical ebb and flow of the way the atmosphere works. And then here's the overview. Now here is the core of our La Niña as we've seen from about 120 west out to about the date line. And there's Hawaii. And one would say that's where the high pressure should be up in the northern latitudes. And that's exactly where it is. So this is all behaving pretty much the way one would expect. Now a week ago or so, this was all yellows and oranges in here. Notice that the pulse of La Niña sort of got some upwelling going here and now we have some blues. But the expectation is that'll settle down and oranges and yellows will build back in here. Also notice the preponderance of warmer than normal water. Now some of this is not all El Nino related. There's just this ongoing trend of the oceans getting warmer year after year after year. And so they have to keep redoing the climatology, what they consider the baseline of what is normal. And some of this is probably attributable to that. But then the other side of it, up in San Francisco this past last week, water temperatures were 60 degrees. For this time of year, that's pretty warm, and you could feel it even today. Water temperatures still 57, 58 degrees. So this maybe, we don't want to start going into the territory of, is this the new normal? But maybe it is, or it could just be we're just waiting for a big storm to come and start the winds to start blowing. Really, it's high pressure off of here that drives north winds. North winds create upwelling, that is bringing cool water from depths to the surface. South winds in this area create downwelling, that is, suppressing the upwelling, and sort of keeps the cool water at depth. If you have a series of low pressure systems tracking from west to east, and the fronts sort of stall out and drag over here, and there's always south winds in front of the front, and that pattern persists, then temperatures are going to stay warmer than normal. It's when you get into the spring and then high pressure builds in, and then you get that raging north wind in the springtime. That's when all your cool water will show up. So it's too early to sort of make any proclamations one way or the other locally, but looking at the big global pattern, there's still a lot of warm water here, both off Africa. Let me slide that over there. Both off Africa and everywhere but in the immediate Niña 1.2 and 3.4 regions. So something to consider. So we've talked about the local storm pattern for the next week or so. Then we talked about the MJO, Madden-Julian oscillation, how that can, or in this case, isn't having a whole lot of an effect, or so we think from all the normal indicators. And then there's the longer-term trend, the 5 to 7 year cycle of El Nino, La Nina. The MJO is a 4 to 6 week cycle on and off. And so next we look at what's going on in the atmosphere. You have to look at all these different variables and then sort of piece it together when it's not real obvious, when the signs aren't clear, and this is certainly one of those. So what's going on? Southern Oscillation Index, difference in pressure between Darwin, Australia, and Tahiti, can give you an indication of what's going on with the MJO and then also maybe the storm track. As you look here, the daily numbers were positive, and somewhere early October, we start seeing little bits of negative, a pulse negative, a little bit of negative recently. Okay, that sort of suggests that maybe the inactive phase of the MJO is trying to lose some control, even though you look at all the data and it's not really clear. So then we look at the 30-day running average. Here was our number. Positive numbers suggest the inactive phase of the MJO. It was up in the 13s, but what is it doing now? It's down to 3.29. And then from an El Nino perspective, or La Nina, the 90-day running average is a way you can look at that. And you can see that we got up to about, 8.4 or so. That was in October. And now the numbers are coming down again. Let's look at this in another perspective. We'll graph this out. 30-day Southern Oscillation Index, and of course we've been through this before. January 2014, you can see the 30-day average. You can just run a line through that and see that it was fading. Negative numbers suggest El Nino if it's over a long period of time. But here's what we're really at, these pulses. This is the active phase of the MJO, inactive, active, inactive. Okay, and here we got into about April this year. Big active phase of the MJO, big inactive phase, and then no active phase, another active phase, and that pretty much, that just killed what was left of El Nino. But now here is where we are. We're just looking at this. Notice the 30-day average is dropping. We're at almost 3. This suggests that perhaps maybe we are trending towards a weak active phase of the MJO, and that would then again suggest that maybe there actually is some this, I'll call it a global pattern support for what's going on in the North Pacific, and maybe the models aren't completely off base, suggesting a little bit more stormier pattern in the week or two ahead. And we can't get to the ESPI index data tonight. Their site appears to be down, and they've been having some problems the past day or two. But we've been watching it. We get in there every now and take a peek. And it's suffice it to say that it's suggestive of certainly La Nina, but the pattern there is also backing off, very much like the Southern Oscillation Index, suggesting that perhaps the pulse of La Nina and the inactive phase of the MJO that we've been in for about a month is starting to back off. So, to wrap things up for right now, Models are looking pretty good. Possible storm production. We really want the storm track to be further south, but we don't expect that to happen reasonably with high pressure and the way La Niña is configured. The storm track, we think, is going to be one of these where it pushes off of Kamchatka and the Kuril Islands, and then the area north of Hawaii is going to be blocked by high pressure most of the winter, and then storms will fall into the Gulf of Alaska and redevelop there. That means a rather northerly swell angle relative to California. Hawaii, more of a long-distance swell pattern coming from off the Kurils, unless we get into winter and the jet stream can rage a little bit and sort of punch a hole in high pressure, and that could happen or could not happen. You see, looking at the MJO data, that the whole pattern is just kind of weak right now, dominated by weak La Niña, and La Niña tends to favor the inactive phase versus the active phase of the MJO, and that sort of makes the storm track suffer. But the good news is, if you have low pressure in the Gulf of Alaska, and a lot of them one after another, at least you can get some precipitation into the Pacific Northwest and down into California. The dividing line seems to be where the precipitation cuts off is somewhere west or east of Monterey Bay. So again, that favors Northern California, the Tahoe region, and then places north of that. So that's the outlook for right now. Hope you enjoyed it. We'll do this again next week, same time, same channel. Thanks for watching.